Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papa Nashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritang cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram. Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. Om Tavakatamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadattatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Janaha. So this morning we will continue our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna where we left off last time. And today's class is very easy for me because it's one of the most delightful passages in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And it's mostly descriptive, and so there's not much explanation needed. It will be mainly reading today of this beautiful passage. I'll give a few explanatory remarks on a couple of things, 2 or 3 things, especially at the beginning, and especially for those who are not that familiar with the details of Ramakrishna's life and happenings. But mostly it will be reading. So today we are on the chapter in the English Gospel entitled The Festival at Panihati, chapter 12, and it is Monday, June 18th, 1883. So Monday, June 18th, 1883, and page 253. So it begins, Sri Ramakrishna had been invited to the great religious festival at Panihati near Calcutta. This festival of the flattened rice was inaugurated by Raghunath Das, a disciple of Sri Chaitanya. It is said that Raghunath used to run away from home, secretly practice his devotions, and enjoy the bliss of spiritual ecstasy. One day, Nityananda said to him, "Thief, you run away from home and enjoy the love of God all alone? You hide it from us. I shall punish you today. You must arrange a religious festival and entertain the devotees with flattened rice." Since then, the festival has been annually celebrated at Panihati by the Vaishnavas. Thousands of the followers of Sri Chaitanya participate in it. Its chief feature is the singing of the names and glories of God and the dancing of the devotees in religious fervor. The center of the festivity is the temple of Radha Krishna, built on the bank of the Ganges. So this is one of the points where I want to stop for a minute and give a little bit of background and explanation, and also context even for those of you who are familiar with the life of Sri Ramakrishna. So first, the general things that people not familiar will need to know. Sri Chaitanya is regarded in India by many, not by everyone, of course, but by many Hindus. He's regarded as an incarnation of God, an avatara. And Sri Ramakrishna himself regarded Sri Chaitanya as an avatara, as an incarnation of God. And he himself came to see that he had been Sri Chaitanya himself. He saw an identity between himself and Sri Chaitanya. So Sri Chaitanya is I want to say founder, but founder is not the right word. Just as Sri Ramakrishna, in one sense, is the founder of the Ramakrishna mission, but Sri Ramakrishna didn't really found anything. He was not an organizer. He didn't set any organizational principles or anything like that. He was the inspiration of the Ramakrishna movement and the spiritual life of the movement. And so in the same way, Sri Chaitanya didn't found anything, but his followers around his personality and teachings founded the school of Bengal Vaishnavism. And so that is the school which many people nowadays know only through Krishna consciousness, ISKCON. ISKCON is one branch. It's not the only by any means. There's one particular branch of the school of Bengal Vaishnavism. And so when you see they're dancing and singing, their kirtan and dancing and so forth, that's a continuation of the tradition of Sri Chaitanya, who spent his life, extraordinary life, Sri Chaitanya, his extraordinary life. Of the ones that are recognized as incarnations of God universally in India, or almost universally in India among the Hindus, the other incarnations of God, recognized incarnations, those who have some claim to historicity, had a much larger influence on history. Say Sri Krishna, Sri Rama. People growing up in the West and not from an Indian background or ancestry may think that, well, Krishna and Rama, what influence did they have? But no, they had a profound influence, not just in India. Sri Ram in particular influenced the whole of Asia, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, the Southeast Asia, from Afghanistan all the way to the Philippines. Sri Ram had an influence. And Sri Krishna, within India, his influence is perhaps even stronger than that of Sri Ram. That could be debated, but certainly as strong. And his influence has gone outside of India as well, though not in as recognizable a form as the influence of Sri Ram. And so both of them had a vast influence on the world. And then, of course, there's Buddha and Jesus, who had great influences over the world. And so in Sri Ramakrishna's time, you find that his teachings have spread around the world already. Within a century of his passing away, his teachings had spread all around the world. So Sri Chaitanya seems to be a minor player in this, but it's said that that God incarnates for different purposes. Sometimes it's for a world mission, and sometimes it's to delight in the company of the devotees. And so it's said that Sri Chaitanya was born as a result of the prayers of a devotee named Advaita. Advaita prayed for the coming of God, that God incarnate because of the decline of religion, remembering Sri Krishna's promise in the Gita, in the 4th chapter of the Gita, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyuthanam dharmasya taratmanam srujamyaham. Whenever in the world dharma declines and adharma, irreligiousness, prevails, then I will body myself forth. That's in the 7th verse of the 4th chapter of the Gita. So remembering that, Advaita prayed to God that the times have become so bad, you must incarnate. And so it said that God incarnated as Sri Chaitanya at that time, but largely for the area of eastern India, where his influence was great and continues to be great. I won't go into the particular historical purposes which his incarnation did serve in that part of the country of India, because it did serve a great purpose. But the main purpose of his incarnation was to delight in the company of the devotees and to delight the devotees themselves, to give delight to the devotees themselves. And so in this narration, you'll hear about Sri Chaitanya and Nityananda. Nityananda was a companion of Sri Chaitanya. And so the two of them spread this love of God through Bengal at a time of great degeneration. And Panihati, the festival which is referred to here, that festival still continues. I myself have been to Panihati a couple of times, not to the festival. I would love to see the festival, but I've been there to the grounds of Panihati, which are always open. There's a Ramakrishna temple there. And so you can see the places where that are mentioned here in the narration that we're going to read. One of the former acharyas of the training center, Swami Jushtanandaji. He passed away several years ago, quite suddenly and quite not at an elderly age. He was middle-aged. Very fine Swami, very scholarly Swami, and one who was filled with this Vaishnava spirit of devotion. And so he could sing very well. He could sing kirtans, a wonderful chanter, wonderful singer, and he would dance. And so he wanted to show me the places along the Ganges. So he took me and a number of brahmacharis from the training center on a boat trip up the Ganges to Panihati, which is right on the Ganges. Bellarmat is downstream. So we went north along the Ganges, and on the opposite side from Bellarmat, the same side as Dakshineshwar. So we went there to Panihati, and so he would lead us in dancing and singing and so forth. We had a wonderful time there. So anyway, the place is still there. The festival is still held. So again, this tells the story of how this festival came to be. And so just since I've given so much commentary in between what I read and now, let me just restate what he says here, what M says here in his narration. That there was this devotee named Raghunath Das, who was a devotee of Sri Chaitanya, and he used to run away from home. Now that, in English, that sounds like a kid running away from home with a bag on his back, going to join the circus. But no, not like that. He would just leave the house without anyone knowing, without telling anyone where he would go, and he would go out into solitude, and there he would lose himself in the ecstasy, singing and dancing in the name of God. And so Nityananda, the companion of Sri Chaitanya, when he heard of this, he calls him thief. Now this, you have to know, was in jest, but in jest with a particular purpose. That is, among the Vaishnavas, it's considered that devotion should be shared. It's one of the places in India where you find communal devotional practice very common. Now, as many of you know, much of Indian spirituality is individual, private, and within oneself. And so in the same family, you can have 2 or 3 members of the same family who are following different paths, and each does their own meditation, their own reading and study, their own practice and so forth. And the other members of the family may not know much about what the person is doing because they just do it quietly. And so much of Hindu spiritual practice is done privately. As Jesus says in the Christian scripture, that one should enter into one's closet and there pray alone, and not as the scribes and Pharisees out in public where everyone can see you, that is showing off your religiosity. Instead of that, he says, go into secret and there pray to God who is in secret. So like that in the Hindu tradition. But again, among the Vaishnavas, there's this tradition of communal dancing and singing and reading of scriptures. It's quite delightful, the tradition. It's a very joyful tradition. So Sri Ramakrishna had been brought up influenced by that tradition. And all his life, he enjoyed singing kirtan, singing and dancing. He would do that among his a few people in his room at Dakshineshwar, and he would do it on occasion at great festivals like this. One other thing, let me say, for those of you who know the life of Ramakrishna, that in the great master, now also known in Swami Chaitananandaji's more recent translation as Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play, There, Swami Saradananda tells that after Sri Ramakrishna had begun to feel soreness in his throat, he went to Panihati. I think that was in 1885, a year and a half before he passed away. It could have been 84, but I don't think he was suffering yet by that time. So it must have been 1885. And so in the Great Master, you also get a beautiful description of Sri Ramakrishna going to Panihati and going into ecstasy again and again, and the extraordinary description of his dance, which is worth reading over and over again, worth meditating upon, as is this. So at this time, Swami Saradanandaji, at that time still Sharat, probably had not even started coming to Sri Ramakrishna. I think it was in 1883 that he started coming. So if he had started coming, he had just started coming, and he wasn't present on this day. So he, in his biography of Sri Ramakrishna, describes the occasion that he himself witnessed. So again, Nityananda challenges Raghunath Das and says, you are a thief. Here you are going off into private, and there enjoying the love of God and ecstasy by yourself. No, now I'm going to prescribe punishment for you. You must arrange a festival, a grand festival where all the devotees of Sri Chaitanya will be invited, and you must feed them all with flattened rice. And so therefore it came to be known as the Festival of the Flattened Rice at Panihati. Panihati is the name of the place. So then it continues. The master had been invited to the festival by Mani Sen, who was the custodian of the temple. That is the temple at Panihati, the Radha Krishna temple. Ram, Rakal, Bhavanath, and a few other disciples went with the master in a carriage. So again, in the great master, Sri Ramakrishna went by boat, but here he went in a carriage. On his way to Panihati, Sri Ramakrishna was in a light mood and joked with the youngsters. But as soon as the carriage reached the place of the festival, the master, to the utter amazement of the devotees, shot into the crowd. So this time Sri Ramakrishna was in his mid-40s. Actually, he was in his late 40s. And so his running into the crowd was a shock to everyone, to see him. He had been joking with everyone, but as we know in Sri Ramakrishna's life, his mood could change just like that. He could go from joking to going into serious and deep ecstasy. And he could come out from ecstasy and then begin to dance and so forth. So anyway, he'd been joking with the youngsters, as it says, and then he shot into the crowd as soon as the boat landed. He joined the kirtan party of Navadvip Goswami, Mani Sen's guru, and danced totally forgetting the world. So Navadvip Goswami is a title of those who are descended from the great disciples of Sri Chaitanya, and they have a special place in the Bengal Vaishnava tradition. So this Navadvip Goswami was the guru of Mani Sen, who was the protector, the manager of the temple, and the one who had invited Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna joined. There would be at Panihati during a festival, there would be different groups of kirtan, different people singing, and different circles of people dancing, or not really a circle in our sense. It would be a crowd of people all dancing together. And so Sri Ramakrishna joined the circle of Navadvip Goswami, the guru of Mani Sen. Every now and then, Sri Ramakrishna stood still in samadhi, carefully supported by Navadvip Goswami for fear that he might fall to the ground. Thousands of devotees were gathered together for the festival. Wherever one looked, there was a forest of human heads. The crowd seemed to become infected by the Master's divine fervor and swayed to and fro, chanting the name of God until the very air seemed to reverberate with it. Now, this is something which is describing an actual tangible experience. There are times and certainly in the presence of someone like Sri Ramakrishna, we can't even imagine it, even if we've experienced it to some degree in other places. In Sri Ramakrishna's presence, it would have been unimaginable, the power and the atmosphere that would have been present when he was dancing and singing, even when he was just seated on his couch speaking. But there are times when the atmosphere becomes spiritually charged, and it's as if there's an electric current in the whole atmosphere. One feels the hair on one's body standing up. And sometimes that happens because we feel inspired inside, and the hair on our body stands up. We get what's called goose flesh. But this comes from the atmosphere itself, the surrounding atmosphere created by a great soul. And so sometimes when there is a supercharged atmosphere, you feel uplifted just by being there. You don't feel that I'm doing anything or that I have accomplished anything. You feel that you've been swept up in a flood and lifted above the world, and everything begins to look luminous. Everything begins to look, there's a different look to everything, a different feel to everything. All of your cares, all of your worries, all of your anxieties are completely washed away. You feel light in body, light in mind, and everything has a numinous quality about it. So that some of us have experienced on rare occasions, but it's unimaginable what the atmosphere would have been in Sri Ramakrishna's presence because of his extraordinary spirituality. So the crowd seemed to become infected by the Master's divine fervor and swayed to and fro, chanting the name of God until the very air seemed to reverberate with it. Drums, cymbals, and other instruments produced melodious sounds. The atmosphere became intense with spiritual fervor. Yes, there's an intensity to the atmosphere, which again, you feel swept up in. Again, not something that's created from inside of you. It's not subjective. It affects you subjectively, but there's an objective uplifting of the atmosphere that you are picked up in. The devotees felt that Gauranga, that is Sri Chaitanya, himself was being manifested in the person of Sri Ramakrishna. Flowers were showered on him from all sides, at his feet and his head. The shouting of the name of Hari was heard even at a distance, like the rumbling of the ocean. So again, you find this vast mass of people. Only those who have been to India can imagine that type of crowd that you get in India. So even at this time, when the population was much, much less, but for a festival like this, in a restricted area, there would just have been, as he says, a sea of heads, and all of those people dancing and singing and shouting Hari, and Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. So Sri Ramakrishna entered by turn into all the moods of ecstasy. That is, sometimes he would be in ecstasy while he was singing, sometimes he would stand with a fixed gaze, and sometimes he would be completely oblivious of the world. Sri Ramakrishna entered by turn into all the moods of ecstasy. In deep samadhi, he stood still, his face radiating a divine glow. In the state of partial consciousness, he danced, sometimes gently and sometimes with the vigor of a lion. Again, regaining consciousness of the world, he sang, himself leading the chorus. So Swami Sarananda also describes Sri Ramakrishna's dancing at Panihati 2 years later, and describes it as the dance of a lion. Again, it's Swami Sarananda says that it looked as if there were no stiff bones in Sri Ramakrishna's body. His body seemed to be turned into fluid and to flow with the most gracious and beautiful movements. Everything, every movement perfect, every movement beautiful and gracious, every movement balanced, and yet with the vigor of a lion. There was a great power and virility expressed through his dance. And so he sang, "Behold, the two brothers have come who weep while chanting Hari's name." So the two brothers again are Sri Chaitanya and Nityananda. They were not blood brothers, they're brothers in spirit. The brothers who dance in ecstasy and make the world dance in his name. Behold them, weeping themselves and making the whole world weep as well. The brothers who, in return for blows, offer to sinners Hari's love. That who themselves receive blows but offer in return love. That's referring to incidents like with the Jogai and Madhai, which will be referenced later, who beat Nityananda, but that Nityananda converted them with his divine love, and they became devotees as well. Behold them drunk with Hari's love, who make the world drunk as well. Behold, the two brothers have come, who once were Kanai and Balai of Braja, that is, at the incarnation of Sri Krishna. They who would steal the butter out of the pots of the gopi maids. Behold, the two have come, who shatter all the rules of caste, embracing everyone as brother, even the outcast shunned by men, who lose themselves in Hari's name, making the whole world mad, who are none other than Hari himself, and chant his hallowed name. Behold them who saved from their sinful ways the ruffians Jogai and Madhai, whom I just told about. They who cannot distinguish between a friend and an enemy. Behold the two brothers Gaur and Nitai, who come again to save mankind. So here's a beautiful song that Sri Ramakrishna was singing and all the others were singing also, and as he danced in ecstasy, forgetful of the world. And so just a few explanations about things that are mentioned in the song. He says, behold, the two brothers have come, who once were Kanai and Balai of Braja. Kanai means Krishna, and Balai means his brother Balaram. And so these two boys in Braja, who were among the Gopas, the cowherd boys, and who would, as naughty boys, would steal butter from the containers of the gopis, the cowherd girls. So embracing everyone as brother, even the outcast shunned by men. So something that is rarely recognized and not recognized in texts about Hinduism written by others. History books, books of instruction used here in America for school kids that tell about different religious traditions. It's rarely recognized that the reform movements, the great liberal movements within India, were all religious movements. The way Hinduism is presented in the West is as a religion which instituted caste and caste discrimination and putting people down and outcasting people and so forth. That was a practice which was all over the world. It lasted in Russia up until the revolution. It lasted here until the end of the Renaissance period and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But in India, all reform always came from religion. So religion was not the cause of discrimination and all of that. Religion was that which again and again great saints like Sri Chaitanya, before him Guru Nanak, before him Sri Gyaneshwar, and many other great saints arose. Sri Ramanuja, the founder of the qualified monist school of Vedanta. They came and opened religion to all, irregardless of caste. And so Sri Chaitanya also, he opened the doors of religion to everyone, even the so-called outcast. Who lose themselves in Hari's name, making the whole world mad, who are none other than Hari himself, that is God himself, and chant his hallowed name. Behold them who saved from their sinful ways the ruffians Jogai and Madhai, they who cannot distinguish between a friend and an enemy. That is, after referring to Jogai and Madhai, the ruffians who beat up Nityananda, they can't distinguish between friend and enemy. And then again, the master sang, see how all of Nadia, Nadia is where Sri Chaitanya lived before he went down to Puri. under the waves of Gauranga's love. So then the narration continues. The crowd, with the master in the center, surged toward the temple of Ramakrishna. Only a small number could enter. The rest stood outside the portal and jostled with one another to have a look at Sri Ramakrishna. In a mood of intoxication, he began to dance in the courtyard of the shrine. Every now and then, his body stood transfixed in deep samadhi. Hundreds of people around him shouted the name of God, and thousands outside caught the strain and raised the cry with full-throated voices. The echo traveled over the Ganges, striking a note in the hearts of people in the boats on the holy river, and they too chanted the name of God. So again, this is a wonderful scene. Or you can picture those who have been to the area, you can picture the boats carrying people across the Ganges. In those days, of course, there were no bridges. And so boats were the only way to cross the river, but they were also used to go up and down the river, even for the same side of the river, to go up and down. And so there would be boats with people on the river. And so out on this wide expanse of the Hooghly branch of the Ganges, in the Ganges Delta, people in boats that were passing by that area could see and hear the singing, and they themselves would join in the singing too, caught up in the atmosphere which spread across the holy Ganges. When the kirtan was over, Mani Sen took Sri Ramakrishna and Navadvip Goswami into a room and served them with refreshments. Afterwards, Ram, M, and the other devotees were also served with the prasad. So first, Sri Ramakrishna, being recognized as a great holy man, would be served first. Others would want to wait until after he had eaten, because then the food that was served to them would be considered blessed by Sri Ramakrishna, having partaken some of it, and it would become prasad, just as food offered to the deity becomes prasad. So in the afternoon, the master was sitting in Mani Sen's drawing room with the devotees. Navadvip, that is Navadvip Goswami, was also near him. Mani offered the carriage hire to Sri Ramakrishna. Pointing to Ram and the others, the master said, "Why should they accept it from you? They earn money." He became engaged in conversation with Navadvip. So here, Mani Sen, he offers Sri Ramakrishna the carriage hire for his having come and for the return hire of the carriage to return to Dakshineshwar, as a good host would do. But you see Sri Ramakrishna's, both his renunciation and his concern. He doesn't want to put a burden on anyone. It's said in the Gita, Sri Krishna says in the Gita, that the devotee seeks not to be a trouble to anyone. And so that you see Sri Ramakrishna spontaneously not wanting the carriage hire to be paid by the one who had invited him. But these other devotees who are very close to him, they can easily pay for the carriage hire. We don't need to take that from you. And so then Master said, Bhakti matured becomes bhava. Next is mahabhava, then prema, and last of all is the attainment of God. Gauranga experienced, Gauranga meaning Sri Chaitanya, experienced the states of mahabhava and prema. When prema is awakened, a devotee completely forgets the world. He also forgets his body, which is so dear to a man. Gauranga experienced prema. He jumped into the ocean, thinking it to be the Jamuna. The ordinary jiva does not experience mahabhava or prema. He goes only as far as bhava. But Gauranga experienced all three states. Isn't that so? Navadvip Goswami. Yes, sir, that is true. The inmost state, the semi-conscious state, and the conscious state. So here, Sri Ramakrishna talks about bhakti when it matures. Bhakti just meaning devotion. So we start with a little bit of devotion, at least enough devotion to make us want to go towards God. It may not be much, we may not feel much, but even if we feel the attraction to go closer to God, to try to do some spiritual practice, to try to learn more. That itself is the beginning of bhakti. So bhakti devotion means the attraction towards the divine, which can begin and begins for most of us very, very weak, just enough to make us want to inquire a little, find out more, and to begin to move a little bit in that direction. But as devotion grows, as devotion becomes stronger and stronger, until we find in great saints a time comes in their life when it becomes a torrent, where they're running towards God and they can't think or don't want to think about anything else. Then devotion eventually matures into bhava. That is, where the devotion is spontaneous and all-consuming, where there's all that you can think about, all that you want to talk about. All that you want is to run and run and run towards God and to forget everything else. And so that is bhava, which you see in great saints around the world. People like St. Francis of Assisi, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila in the West, in some of the great Sufi saints, and in many, many Hindu saints from all over India. You find this state of bhava. But then there are two stages beyond that, Mahabhava and Prema. And Sri Ramakrishna says that only an incarnation of God can attain to those two states. And those are states that you see in the life of Sri Chaitanya, and you see them in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. In Mahabhava, there are certain signs of Mahabhava. Sometimes Sri Chaitanya would sweat drops of blood. So intense would be his longing for God that he would sweat drops of blood. You see in the Christian scripture, the Bible, that Jesus, when he's on the cross, he's sweating drops of blood. Now, there are a number of places in the Gospels telling the life of Jesus where someone from the well-versed in the Hindu tradition can see that, yes, this is a truth. They're telling a truth here which is known, which is recognized, which has a tradition behind it. And if you have a tradition behind you, then these things you can recognize and you can understand. In the Christian world, because that tradition was not there, many of these things are not recognized and are just thought of as something that was special to Jesus. But no, this was a sign that Jesus was an incarnation. So again, someone who knows the tradition sees these things. So then the master said, in the inmost state, he would remain in samadhi. Oh, he's talking about Sri Chaitanya. In the inmost state, he would remain in samadhi, unconscious of the outer world. In the semi-conscious state, he could only dance. In the conscious state, he chanted the name of God. So in the inmost state, he would remain in samadhi, unconscious of the outer world. In the semi-conscious state, he could only dance. And then in the conscious state, he would sing and chant the name of God. So these were the three states that Chaitanya was in. So Sri Chaitanya, like Sri Ramakrishna, he spent the later years of his life in almost continuous ecstasy. Navadvip introduced his son to the master. The young man was a student of the scriptures. He saluted Sri Ramakrishna. Navadvip. He studies the scriptures at home. Previously, one hardly saw a copy of the Vedas in this country. Max Mueller has translated them so people can now read these books. Master. Too much study of the scriptures does more harm than good. The important thing is to know the essence of the scriptures. After that, what is the need of books? One should learn the essence and then dive deep in order to realize God. So here Sri Ramakrishna, first Navadvip Goswami introduces his son and says he studies the scripture, which one would think, well, that's very good that he's studying the scripture. But Sri Ramakrishna says that too much study of the scriptures is not good. So why did he say that? The reason is that a person who studies the scriptures too much there's the tendency, not that this happens to everyone, but there's a tendency to substitute the reading of spirituality for spirituality itself. There's a tendency to substitute the concepts of spirituality for the experience of spirituality. So as Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother used to frequently say, that it's enough just to get the essence of the scriptures and then practice. Now, Swami Vivekananda, he put more emphasis than Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother. He would put more emphasis on the study of the scriptures. And that, I think, is because Swami Vivekananda saw everything, and that was the purpose of his part in the play of Sri Ramakrishna. He saw everything within a historical context. And as he said in his rules for the order, monastic orders, in absence of study, degenerate. The monastic orders, in absence of study, degenerate. And you can find that among the traditional monks in India. Those who are ignorant and those who don't know the scriptures, there's a great degeneration. And so Swami Vivekananda promoted the study of the scriptures in the order, and himself used to teach classes on the scriptures and have others like Swami Turiyananda teach classes. And so we have to balance these two. Both of them are true. Both of them are correct. So Sri Ramakrishna, you find that almost always Sri Ramakrishna is talking to an individual for a particular immediate purpose. And so one of I mentioned the dangers and overemphasis of the scriptures. One is substituting conceptual religion for actual experiential religion. Another is substituting reading the texts for actually trying to practice what the texts are talking about. And another, of course, is the egotism that comes from being a pundit. And so all of those Sri Ramakrishna saw as dangers. On the other hand, the mind has to be engaged in something. And so if we can avoid those dangers and use the scriptures just to point us in the direction of God, then study of scriptures can be of a great help. And so again, Swami Vivekananda saw that the absence of study of scriptures in a historical context and for large numbers of people, that has a harmful effect. So the Master continued, "The Divine Mother has revealed to me the essence of the Vedanta. It is that Brahman alone is real and the world illusory. The essence of the Gita is what you get by repeating the word 10 times. As he would say elsewhere, Gita, 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 Gita. The Gita becomes Tagi, which refers to Tyagi, meaning a renunciate. So the word becomes reversed. It is then Tagi, which refers to renunciation. The essence of the Gita is, O man, renounce everything and practice spiritual discipline for the realization of God." So that, he says, is the essence of the Gita. Once you know that, then why do you need to keep going over and over and over again? So for a person for whom that's enough, yes, that's good. That's good. Then we should run forward. And if we had a master like Sri Ramakrishna, then that would be enough. That would be enough. Navadvip. But how can we persuade our minds to renounce? That is, again, Sri Ramakrishna said the message of the Gita is Tagi, or renunciation. You are a Goswami. It is your duty to officiate as priest in the temple. You cannot renounce the world. Otherwise, who would look after the temple and its services? You have to renounce mentally. It is God himself who has kept you in the world to set an example to men. You may resolve in your mind 1,000 times to renounce the world, but you will not succeed. God has given you such a nature that you must perform your worldly duties. And here we remember M and others, disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, who went to him saying that, "Sir, I want to renounce the world." And Sri Ramakrishna said, "No, that's not for you. You must show a way for the householders. You must continue to live in the world." To M, he said, "You must teach the Bhagavatam to the world." And so M understood that to be not just the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Purana, Mahapurana, nor the Chaitanya Bhagavatam, the life of Sri and doings of Sri Chaitanya, but also the Kotamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, as the modern Bhagavatam. Krishna said to Arjuna, "What do you mean you will not fight? By your mere will, you cannot desist from fighting. Your very nature will make you to fight. And so, O Arjuna, you must fight," as Sri Krishna says again and again in the Gita. So Sri Ramakrishna is using that as an example that you, Navadvip Goswami, your nature is different. You have to take care of this temple. You have to teach the devotees. You have to remain in the world, perform your spiritual duties, your religious duties. And through that, you will be blessed. Your very nature will make you to do that. At the mere mention of Krishna and Arjuna, the master again went into samadhi. In the twinkling of an eye, his body became motionless and his eyeballs transfixed, while his breathing could scarcely be noticed. At this sudden transformation, Navadvip and his son and the other devotees looked at the master in mute wonder. Regaining partial consciousness, he said to Navadvip, "Yoga and Bhoga. You Goswamis have both. Now your only duty is to call on God and pray to him sincerely, 'O God, I don't want the glories of thy world bewitching Maya. I want thee alone.' God dwells in all beings undoubtedly. That being the case, who may be called his devotee? He who dwells in God, he who has merged his mind and life and innermost soul in God." So a beautiful description of a true devotee. The master returned to the sense plane. Referring to his samadhi, he said to Navadvip, "Some say that this state of mine is a disease. I say to them, how can one become unconscious by thinking of him whose consciousness has made the whole world conscious?" So that also, Shivanath Shastri said that Sri Ramakrishna, by thinking about God so much, he would fall unconscious. And so Sri Ramakrishna challenged him, how is it possible that one who thinks of the source of consciousness itself could fall unconscious? Mani Sen said goodbye to the invited Brahmins and Vaishnavas with suitable gifts of money. That's a traditional practice, devout practice. He offered 5 rupees to Sri Ramakrishna. The latter, in those days, 5 rupees was a significant amount. It's nothing now, but at that time it was significant. The latter, Sri Ramakrishna, said that he could not possibly accept any money, but Mani insisted. The master then asked him in the name of his guru not to press him. Mani requested him again to accept the offering. Sri Ramakrishna asked him in a distressed voice whether he should take the money. The disciple made a vehement protest and said, "No, sir, by no means." Friends of Mani Sen gave the money to Rakal, that is the future Swami Brahmananda, who was still a teenager, I believe, at this time. Actually, he had just turned 20 this year, requesting him to buy some mangoes and sweets for the master. Sri Ramakrishna said to him, I have definitely said to Mani that I would not accept the money. I feel free now, but Rakal has accepted it. His is now the responsibility. Sri Ramakrishna, accompanied by the devotees, took a carriage to return to Dakshineshwar. They were going to pass the temple garden of Matisil on the way. For a long time, the master had been asking him to take him to the reservoir in the garden in order that he might teach him how to meditate on the formless God. There were tame fish in the reservoir. Nobody harmed them. Visitors threw puffed rice and other food into the water, and the big fish came in swarms to eat the food. Fearlessly, the fish swam in the water and sported there joyously. Coming to the reservoir, that is Sri Ramakrishna with his party, they stopped there at the reservoir. Coming to the reservoir, the master said to him, "Look at the fish. Meditating on the formless God is like swimming joyfully like these fish in the ocean of bliss and consciousness." So M had been asked, when he first came to Sri Ramakrishna, the master asked him, how do you like to think of God? Of God with form or God without form? And M, being influenced both by modern British education and by the Brahma Samaj, he said, I prefer to think of God without form. And so that's why Sri Ramakrishna had wanted to show him this sight so that he could meditate on the formless God, thinking of himself like a fish swimming in the ocean of bliss and consciousness, the infinite, limitless ocean of bliss and consciousness, as a way to meditate on the formless God. So you see that Sri Ramakrishna was always wanted to be in his spiritual instruction and his spiritual practice as concrete as possible. So he could have just said that meditate on yourself like a fish swimming in the ocean of the consciousness and bliss of God, and that would have been the end of it, and it wouldn't have come up again. But no, now a year later, Sri Ramakrishna wants to show him an actual example of the fish swimming in the water so that he has something tangible to grasp in a more concrete way as he's meditating. So his imagination will be more realistic. And so with Sri Ramakrishna's own spiritual practice, when he took money, coins in one hand and clods of earth in another hand, and said, earth, money, earth, money, earth, money, and threw them both into the water and said, neither is of any use for the realization of God. So he reduced it to a physical practice in order to get the idea into not just on the surface of his mind, but into his very nervous system. And so you see, that was something that he did in his teachings to others and in his practice. So here we come to the end of the day, and so we will stop here and take up next time, Monday, June 25th, 1883. So let me give the announcements, and then we will have the closing prayer, or if there are questions, I'll take questions. So the announcements. On Sunday, I will speak on the series, Small Vedantic Texts. And for Sunday, I will take the text Vedanta Sara, which means the essence of Vedanta, which is considered a short compendium of the basic teachings of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, much used among students of Advaita Vedanta. And next week, we will continue the class on the Bhagavad Gita on Tuesday evenings at 7:30, and this class on Thursday morning at 11 o'clock, all over YouTube. Yes, Surenji. Yes. So the question is about the concept of avatar as it's found in the scriptures like the Srimad Bhagavatam, and as we find believed in among many Hindus, and especially in the Ramakrishna tradition. Not exclusive to us, but certainly among the followers of the Ramakrishna mission. So there is the statement of Sri Krishna in the Gita, which is just a general statement that whenever religion declines and irreligion prevails, then I, God, body myself forth. I come in human form for the salvation of religion and for the uplift of humanity. And so that's a general promise that is what I do. Then in texts like the Srimad Bhagavatam, you find what I would say is a mythologized version of the avatara. Now, there may be mythology has deep significance within it. So mythology doesn't mean made up off of the top of the mind by some person who had too vivid an imagination and made up all kinds of fanciful fairy tales and things. No, there's deep meaning within it. But mythology is not history. And so in the Srimad Bhagavatam, they tell of the 10 incarnations. The first of the incarnations was when God incarnated as a fish, Matsya Avatara. And then God incarnated as a tortoise, the Kurma Avatara, and then God incarnated as a boar, a pig, the Varaha Avatara, and then as half man, half lion, and then Parashurama, who went around with an axe. Parashurama means Rama with an axe, went around killing people who he thought needed to be killed. And then you get Rama and Krishna and at the Buddha, and then the last incarnation of the 10 incarnations is Kalki. And so Kalki is pictured in what I would say are mythological terms. He comes riding on a white horse, etc. And that is a mythological explanation of the Avatara. And so many people say, well, where is Sri Ramakrishna? Where is Sri Chaitanya? They're not mentioned in that list of 10 incarnations, so they're not incarnations. The scriptures have said, well, that's fundamentalism, no better than Christian or Muslim fundamentalism or Jewish fundamentalism. That's just fundamentalism, saying that restricting the truth to what is written in texts without even understanding what the texts are trying to say, but just taking the text says, this is what the texts say, and you have to believe it. No, that's silly. The texts themselves, the Srimad Bhagavatam, the same text that talks about the 10 incarnations, it says in places that there are 25 incarnations. Another place it says that there are countless incarnations of God. And so the 10 incarnations, that's just a mythological statement. That's not speaking of history. And again, I don't mean that it has no value, but that its value is the value of mythology, not the value of history. And so the idea of the incarnation is that that when God incarnates, there is a tremendous manifestation of spiritual power, which is of quite a different nature from an ordinary person like you or me if we were to attain to realization and become great saints. Even if we became a great saint like Saint Francis of Assisi or Saint Teresa of Avila or the Gyaneshwar or the other great saints of India. There's a difference between the avatara and a great saint. For one thing, the great saint has to come up through karma and realize God. The avatara comes with a particular purpose without the burden of karma. They have extraordinary bodies which are able to retain tremendous spiritual experience. That's why only an incarnation can sustain Mahabhava and Prema Bhakti. Because the frame of an ordinary jiva can't. The nerves will be destroyed. The body itself will be destroyed. The person will die before they experience that full state of Mahabhava. And so the incarnation is an extraordinary vessel of spirituality who liberates many people. They can liberate people at a touch. Now you hear of holy people in India who sometimes touch somebody and people feel a thrill and so forth. That's not the same thing. I don't doubt that there are people who can do that, to touch somebody and give them a thrill or something. Sri Ramakrishna, by looking at someone, by a wish or by a touch, could liberate a person from samsara itself. That's what an incarnation can do. And so an incarnation, Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Chaitanya are regarded as incarnations because they had that extraordinary power. And because even after they have passed away, by meditating on them, chanting their name, one can realize God. And so it's fundamentalism to restrict truth to the words of the scriptures. That's why in the Vedanta tradition, the Advaita tradition of Vedanta, it said you have to test things by Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. Only then should you accept something. So Shruti, the scriptures, yes, the scriptures, we believe that they are teaching the truth. But how do we know that it's the truth and not just something made up? Because we find it's true to yukti, which means reason. It's reasonable, not discoverable perhaps by reason, but it doesn't contradict reason. It's reasonable. And anubhava is true to experience, true to experience. So a truth has to meet those three standards. It has to be in tune with the scriptures, it has to be reasonable, and it has to be true to experience. And so just saying that, well, the scriptures say that there are 10 incarnations and Between Buddha and Kalki, there's nobody else, so there can't be anybody else. Well, no, that's just fundamentalism. That's taking a mythological statement and enforcing that on history is no different than saying, well, the Bible says that the creation happened in 6 days, and so modern science is confused. They don't know what they're talking about because the Bible says it, that creation took place in 6 days. Well, no, that's fundamentalism wherever we find it. So then a question, is there a way to experience this dancing and chanting other than Hare Krishna temple? A good question, Regina. That in other Vaishnava temples sometimes, other Bengal Vaishnava temples, in our tradition, why don't we continue with that? Sri Ramakrishna himself did it, and sometimes Swami Vivekananda and his disciples would dance in ecstasy also. You don't find that among us, except on rare occasions. Like I've danced with a large crowd of swamis and brahmacharyas at Bellarmat on many occasions, on special days, like Sri Ramakrishna's birthday, on Sri Chaitanya's birthday, rare occasions like that, to Shivaratri. The reason why we don't do it regularly is because there's the danger, two main dangers in this doing it as a practice. So it is a practice, and many people have attained great results through it. So this is not a condemnation in general. It is a recognition that there are dangers in it, and that's why Swami Vivekananda discouraged it in our order as a regular practice. But it should come as something that results from the state that we enter into. One danger is that people begin to practice going into ecstasy so that they can impress other people. That happened even in the lifetime of Sri Ramakrishna, and that's why Swami Vivekananda discouraged it. Some of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna would go home and practice going into ecstasy so that when they came back, they could pretend that they were in ecstasy. And so there's the danger of pretense, putting on a show. It should come from the inside as something which you can no longer control because your mood is in such a high, you're in such a high mood, you can't control it. So that's one danger. The other danger, an even greater danger, is, as Swami Vivekananda said, that by the artificial stimulation of spiritual emotion, working yourself up into a spiritual state through singing and dancing, that if you don't have the character to sustain it, if you don't have the austerity behind you to sustain it, afterwards there'll be a tremendous fall as a reaction. Because you're working yourself up into that state, there's going to come the reaction, the fall. If you're not going into that state spontaneously because of the elevation of your mood first. And that is a fact that you find in all sects, East and West, who have that sort of overly emotional approach and work themselves up into an emotional frenzy. That yes, a person can work themselves up into an ecstatic state, but afterwards terrible things happen. There's a lot of debauchery and immorality among such groups. And that you find if you've ever read books like The Grapes of Wrath, and I think maybe East of Eden mentions it also by John Steinbeck. He talks about a fact which is well known among those who follow such things, that among the Pentecostal and the groups of Christian evangelicals who are the more ecstatic, who go into states, who speak in tongues and things, that after revivals where people engage in such things, then there's all kinds of debauchery that happens because, yes, they work themselves up into a frenzy, they experience an altered state, and afterwards the mind comes down and they're much worse off than they were before. So the reaction to such artificial stimulation of an ecstatic state is far worse than not having had the state at all. So Swami Vivekananda emphasized that one should do spiritual practice and attain to a state where that comes naturally. So like our Swami Shraddhanandaji, who passed away some years ago, the head of our Sacramento Center for many years, he would sometimes sing and dance And again, I've seen it and I've participated in it on rare occasions at Bellarmine as well. But that's why we don't do it as a practice. So I think that was the last of the questions. Good question. So, okay. So let me give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anandarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhृतविग्रहं Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu